Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all. We're very happy to be here today hosting yet another session of our seminar series, Topics in Early Modern Studies. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd first like to give you the house rules. Please keep your microphones muted during the entire talk. After the presentation, we'll have time for questions. I would also ask you to either write your questions in the chat or use the raise your hand function to let us know that you'd like to speak, whichever you feel most comfortable with. When writing in the chat, please feel free to make your questions in English, Portuguese, Spanish, or French. Finally, I would also like to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel later on. We're very happy to welcome today Professor Laurent Curelly. He's a professor of 17th century British studies at Université d'Alsace. He wrote his PhD on Tears and Weeping in the poetry of Crawshaw, Donne, Herbert, Southwell, and Vaughan. His main research topics include 17th century English literature and poetry, history of the English press in the 17th century, as well as the interconnections between radicalism, literature, and politics during the English Revolution. He is the author of The Moderate, an anatomy of an English radical newspaper, L'alchimie des larmes dans la poésie des dévotions anglaises du XVIIe siècle, as well as the editor of Radical Voices, Radical Ways, alongside Nigel Smith, and La force du commerce, commerce, économie et dynamique marchande dans les mondes anglophones au XVIIe et XVIIIe siècle, to cite but a few. Today, he'll be presenting the paper titled Not That I'm a Whit Opinionated of Rhyming Constantly, British Civil War Newsbooks and the Poeticisation of Politics, which we're all very excited to hear. So thank you, Professor Curelly, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lívia and Verônica, for inviting me. Muito obrigado. The quote I chose for the title of this presentation comes from Mercurius Pragmaticus, a royalist newspaper published in April 1648 by Martin, a journalist who switched allegiance several times during the British Civil Wars. Now, I'd like to quote a larger extract from this newspaper issue. Could you please move to the second slide? Right, now you have it on your screen. Not that I'm a whit opinionated of this way of rhyming constantly, but only to tickle and charm the more vulgar fantasies who little regard truths in a grave and serious garb, have I hitherto been thus light and fantastic, both in verse and prose. And so I must still continue, but yet I would have you know, in the midst of jest, I am much in earnest. And all of those nods which I give the members, whereby he meant the members of Parliament, his political rivals, to crack in merriment, I hope themselves and others will be able to pick out the kernel. So although Needham claims here, somewhat disingenuously, it must be said, that he was averse to the inclusion of poetry and more generally to the use of satire in newspapers, is Mercurius Pragmaticus, the royalist weekly that he wrote, was peppered with political satire, or with satirical poetry. This Mercury, as this type of newspapers was called, was part of a vibrant news market and culture, with publications often mixing reportage and polemics. The expansion of this market was fostered by the Civil Wars, which did not only whet readers' appetite for news, but made it increasingly necessary for belligerents to use cheap print for propagandistic purposes. The mid-17th century revolution culminated, as you know, in the trial and execution of Charles I, the collapse of monarchical order, and the establishment of the Commonwealth, a republican regime that was of an oligarchic nature and fell far short of meeting democratic expectations. Now, the democratization of politics was encouraged by many rank-and-file soldiers of the New Model Army and radical sects, to the extent that Marxist historians of the period claimed that the proliferation of radical sects pointed to a revolution within the revolution. Although it is difficult to evaluate the impact of these fringe groups, it is a fact that their ideas were disseminated through pamphlets and newspapers. British Civil War newspapers thus reflected a whole range of opinions which were expressed in a wide variety of books of news, as they were called. These periodicals, published on a weekly basis, had generally similar formats, because of technical imperatives, but accommodated variations which marked them off from rival publications. Two forms of journalism coexisted during the Civil Wars. The diurnal type was of an informative nature, while the Mercury type was of a sardonic nature and sported satire as a badge of authority. There could be some overlap between these generic categories, and a diurnal could contribute to polemic or spark controversy, just as a Mercury did. Mercuries were by no means the preserve of English royalists, but they were clearly not the format that their parliamentarian rivals favoured. Investigated royalist weeklies especially rewarding, as most of these writings were highly charged pieces of polemic, not unlike pamphlets, actually, penned by authors who made a point of lampooning their political opponents. So if royalist authors were especially expert at spicing up their news with satirical content, some of their adversaries, parliamentarian adversaries, took up the gauntlet and responded to the attacks in the same vein. In this talk, I will focus on Mercuries, that is to say, those newspapers that came to include explicit literary forms, whereby I mean essentially poetic forms. The overwhelming majority of them were royalist Mercuries, while parliamentarian newsbooks had more of a standard format, which, however, did not rule out innovative practices such as the introduction of editorials or the inclusion of announcements and advertisements. Now, from an epistemological perspective, it makes sense to study Civil War weeklies, not just for their historical value, but also for their intrinsically literary quality. Until recently, Civil War weeklies tended to be studied and valued for their historical potential as witnesses of a troubled age when war was also fought in pamphlets, while their literary dimension was often neglected. Now, this unfortunate oversight is being redressed, and newsbooks are increasingly investigated as literary objects in their own right, in terms of the way they recycled literary genres and conventions, now following literary traditions, now challenging norms and twisting codes. The exploration of newsbooks as pertaining to an extended literary repertoire that goes beyond the canon and includes elements of low culture, I would argue, is best conducted from an interdisciplinary perspective, one that brings together literary and historical analysis. From a methodological point of view, my paper borrows from interdisciplinary investigations of Civil War periodicals that address generic and stylistic issues as well as political matters, and acknowledge newsbooks as part of the literary heritage of early modern England. This approach is especially suitable for royalist newsbooks, as these periodicals clearly bore traces of a more aristocratic culture. Civil War royalist publications have received renewed attention in recent years, and it is only fitting that studies of these weeklies should cast greater light on the porosity of discourse between low culture, as can be found in newsbooks, and court culture, which not even the regicide was able to extirpate. Royalist newspapers are all the more interesting as they were unlicensed publications, which therefore did not come under the scrutiny of state censors. Their authors were chased and sometimes arrested, but their content was relatively unconstrained, or if there were constraints, these were mainly due to conditions of publication, since these newspapers were produced hastily, both to evade censors and to keep up with the news. Now, I will concentrate on the way royalist Mercuries appropriated poetic forms. These periodicals are unique as they combined news with its customary periodicity and seriality on the one hand, and poetic fragments with their own features on the other hand, and more often than not, offered a mix of both. No publications that show the same degree of journalistic creativeness were produced in 17th century Europe, while Mazarinades, in France, were as close to these publications as could be in terms of poetic inventiveness. They did not create a form of literary journalism that was central to the British Civil Wars, with the first Mercuries becoming templates for later titles, and all of them pursuing a political agenda. So I think this was uniquely British. I would like to address these 3 points in this talk. I will begin with a presentation of poetic forms as may be found in Civil War periodicals. I will then discuss the way these publications made use of poetic satire as a political weapon, and I will finish my talk by trying to answer this question: what do these newspapers tell us about such a significant event as the English Revolution? So I'd like to move to my first part. So this is slide number 3, which has the title, Snippets of Poetry in Royalist Mercury's A Bird's Eye View. As I have just said, the inclusion of snippets of poetry is a distinguishing feature of Royalist journalism. The tradition of incorporating poetry into newspapers was initiated by 3 major Royalist newspapers that began publication in the year 1647, after the First Civil War had come to an end. This tradition was continued by writers of later Royalist periodicals, notably 1648 ephemerals, which did not survive a few issues, as well as newspapers that were revived or came to life after the regicide. Now, the 3 major Royalist weeklies that came off the presses in 1647, in the order in which they appeared, were Mercurius Melancholicus, slide number 4. Okay, this is Mercurius Melancholicus, Mercurius Pragmaticus, that's slide number 5, which is the newspaper I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, and Mercurius Elenchticus. They went out of the market at the time of the regicide, but were briefly revived afterwards. They came to develop a distinct identity, in particular because of the forms of poetry that they included and the way they turned it into polemic. What I mean by identity here are the features that made these newspapers different from parliamentarian publications in terms of content, layout, and internal organization. In an attempt to penetrate what was a highly competitive news market, many newsbook writers had an interest in offering publications that were marginally or significantly different from rival weeklies. And as they gained popularity and became authoritative in the Royalist circles, Mercury's developed their own internal stylistic codes, which differentiated them from their rivals. They seem to have been popular enough for counterfeit issues to be produced. Some later Royalist periodicals paid tribute to them, to the 3 of them, referring to them as models and making a point of writing in the same vein, but at the same time they were anxious to stand out from their competitors in order to carve out a place for themselves on the busy news market. Characteristic of almost all Royalist ephemerals was the inclusion of a poem on the title page, as well as a final epigram, a practice that was initiated by the author of Mercurius Melancholicus and very soon taken up by Pragmaticus and Elenchticus. And here on this slide, you can see the opening poem in these publications. So the opening poems in Elenchticus, as you can see here, and Pragmaticus had a lighter tone than those in Melancholicus, which, as the title suggests, had more gravitas or gravity in them. And it seems to me that these poems reflected the 2 modes that were characteristic of Royalist journalism then. Most Mercuries adopted a playful tone, as did Elenchticus and Pragmaticus, but a few of them were of a melancholic character, a contrast, if you like, that was encapsulated in the Democritus-Heraclitus opposition inspired by Montaigne's essays, as well as Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Now, interestingly enough, in the early 1650s, the Royalist author John Crouch produced 2 Mercuries, one entitled Mercurius Democritus and named after the laughing philosopher, and the other, Mercurius Heraclitus, named after the weeping philosopher, which was less of a playful newspaper than Mercurius Democritus. And as it happens, the Mercurius Democritus had a longer life than Mercurius Heraclitus. Now, in terms of format, these opening poems, liminal poems, were made in newspapers in which they were printed instantly recognizable by readers. There were hallmarks that these publications sported as a badge of allegiance to the king and the royalist party. In terms of content, opening poems performed an obvious propagandistic function in defense of the king. There's always something arbitrary about categorization, but it may be argued that these poems fell into two groups, although there may have been some overlap between them. Many of them were in line with current issues. This would be the first category, whereas others were more general in scope and advanced a program which did not simply boil down to a response to events. The latter category, for example, included the poem inaugurating the second issue of Mercurius Insanissimus. Now, could you please move to slide number 6? Mercurius Insanus Insanissimus, which, as the title shows, promoted an ethos of madness, to take up a phrase used by Nigel Smith in his Literature and Revolution. It went beyond vilifying parliamentarians and cheering up royalists. Now, let me read the opening poem, or part of it. Hark, boys, hark. Where do you think, boys? Shall we go, drink, boys? For the world's turned topsy-turvy, the gentry is overthrown, and none knows his own, for which made me thank a scurvy, Parliament, I mean, who have banished clean all honesty, right, and reason. These lines have, as you can hear, have a musical quality to them, which makes them playful and entertaining and easy to memorize, very much like a broadside ballad, many of which were actually of a political nature, and some of which found their way into royalist Mercuries. The poem and what follows describe a world that has gone awry, one in which social order has been turned upside down, the gentry has been overthrown, and plebeian anti-normative attitudes prevail. Apart from opening poems, another remarkable feature of royalist weeklies was the use of epigrams, especially but not exclusively at the end of newspaper issues. Epigrams were a common feature of royalist periodicals and were in favor with royalist circles, including during the Civil Wars. Epigrams were praised for their witty mordancy. It is no surprise that newsbooks that included snippets of poetry also featured epigrams, which, because of their shortness, fitted in nicely with news items, which were often short pieces. Newspaper authors especially used them to wrap up an argument and to impart cohesion to their quintessentially piecemeal books of news. Epigrams were typical of news writers shifting almost seamlessly from prose to poetry and back to prose, not only as a way to show off their talents, but primarily to introduce variety and make their argument more forceful. Royalist Mercuries were remarkable for their hybrid quality. They were similar to political tracts in that news was very often mixed up with biting attacks on Parliament. They helped to carry polemic further afield as these paper bullets became part and parcel of a war that their writers thought could be won as much in print as on the battlefield. Poetry was instrumental in waging this all-out war and shaping public opinion. Some opening poems included a literary and political program that underscored the performative quality of poetry when it came to dealing blows to the enemy, and allowed royalist authors to brag about their own role in waging a necessary paper war. Building upon a long-standing tradition of polemical writing and satire and caricature in particular, these authors viewed polemic as an essential ingredient of journalism. Now, it is impossible to assess the impact of these poetic fragments, but they must have been successful enough for some authors who supported Parliament to produce newsbooks that adopted a similar format to that of Royalist Mercuries and also included poetry. Most of these parliamentarian Mercuries, a phrase that sounds like a contradiction in terms, came to life during the Second Civil War and were short-lived titles. I will not discuss them for want of time, but it is significant that parliamentarian authors included their own poetry, and much the same forms of poetry at that, in an effort to emulate royalist writers. The snippets of poetry that characterized Royalist Mercuries may be seen as remnants of a court culture that was severely undermined because of the king's exile and then captivity, but they were not exclusively the preserve of the Royalists. Again, opening poems may have been popular enough for a journalist like Marchman Needham, who switched allegiance on several occasions during the Civil Wars to try and clear his conscience in the early years of the restoration of the Stuart monarchy by printing a collection of the opening poems that he had written for Pragmaticus. And these poems certainly helped his case. Most of this poetry, as I said, was satirical, and the use of satire is the issue that I would like to address now. So could you please move to the next slide, Veronica? Satire in Civil War newspapers, the case of the Man in the Moon and Mercurius Democritus. So Royalist newsbooks are of particular interest as the authors consistently use satire as a mode of expression and developed a reputation for the biting quips and comments with which they commonly interspersed whatever news they had to offer. This is perhaps why Royalist weeklies seem to modern-day readers to be less informative than their parliamentarian rivals. Parliamentarian newsbooks were typically more serious than their Royalist competitors, and the seriousness led some of them to be described as dull or drab publications by critics, that is, rather unfair, or historians, rather unfairly, it should be said. Now, I'd like to look at the use of poetry as satire in two Royalist newsbooks, The Man in the Moon and Mercurius Democritus, which I find particularly interesting because John Crouch, the author, makes a point of subverting literary decorum in them. Now, to give you a taste of the way this newsbook, The Man in the Moon, has been perceived by generations of scholars, I can mention the early 20th century Tory historian J.B. Williams, who excoriated the abominable, and this is the adjective he used, actually, the abominable parliamentarian periodicals, but was especially sympathetic to Royalist newspapers. Could you move to the next slide, Veronica, please? However, it described The Man in the Moon as a, quote, coarse and vulgar, but an amusing and witty periodical. However, it dismissed Crouch's later publications like Mercurius Democritus as, I quote, a series of periodicals in which the humor was a more dubious kind and which, for the coarseness, was substituted a deliberate pornography impossible to match in English literature. Williams rightly noticed that there was difference in tone between The Man in the Moon and Mercurius Democritus, but he wrongly attributed it to any degree of obscenity. Democritus was no more vulgar or bawdy than The Man in the Moon. It is true, however, that the humor in it was of a different kind, whether it was of a dubious kind or not. Well, I leave it to you up to you to decide. I would argue that the difference between these publications lies in the way their author handled satire and the effect he aimed at. The Man in the Moon was the only Royalist Mercury that came to life after the regicide in 1649, while other Royalist public newsbooks had either disappeared from the market or were briefly revived. It was issued for slightly over a year, from April 1649 to June 1650, a watershed in the history of the British Isles. Its publication coincided with the establishment of the Republic, the Commonwealth's military campaign in Ireland, radical agitation in the New Model Army, with level-led mutinies in the spring of 1649, and the last stint of leveller activism triggered by Lilburn's trial in the autumn of 1649. The publication of The Man in the Moon was also contemporaneous with the engagement controversy following the imposition of the engagement, an oath to be taken by all English male adults aimed at securing obedience to the Commonwealth. The Republic got off to an uncertain start, and from its very inception, it was beset by political instability, coming not only from royalists, but notably in Ireland, but also from the radical French in and outside the army. The last thing the Commonwealth wanted in 1649-1650 was the pressed royalist papers, of course, but also homebred parliamentarian newsbooks fanning the flames of discord. Hence the passing of the stringent September 1649 Licensing Act aimed at scandalous books and pamphlets, a final attempt to gag the press. Even licensed parliamentary newsbooks were forced out of publication, while The Man of the Moon was one of two unlicensed news sheets to survive this law. Its author, John Crouch, delighted in playing cat and mouse with state censors and managed to evade the ban on seditious publications. What is striking about The Man in the Moon is how much it aimed to provoke laughter, much more than its royalist predecessors. The very title, The Man in the Moon, was revealing of Crouch's approach to news writing in the post-regicide era. In addition to its intertextual potency, a reference to Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Man in the Moon suggests an observer writing from a vantage point that allowed him to scrutinize the contemporary political stage while affecting distance regarding events that Crouch cannot have been wholly indifferent to. Precisely the originality of The Man in the Moon came from the fact that it made a case for laughter at a time when royalists were busy mourning their departed king, while the regicide sparked a continuous flood of elegy writing initiated by Icon Basilicae, the work that inspired Charles I's martyrology. The Man in the Moon, which appeared in April 1649, helped to fashion a post-elegiac frame of mind. He appropriated the ingredients of martyrological writing to contribute to the post-mortem literary sanctification of the late king, as in these lines. Could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Thy woeful crown of thorn is laid aside, and by thy Saviour thou sittst glorified. But Crouch always pulled himself together and made a point of providing a comic resolution to what was perceived as the state tragedy that the regicide had brought about. Laughter was not gratuitous. It was a means to an end, allowing Crouch to taunt and deride his political enemies. Crouch relentlessly chased, ridiculed, and chastised his adversaries. He kept making fun of them, even when they were dead, as he supplied mock epitaphs for them, for example. He was not the first newspaper writer to include parodic forms, as these were often the fare of royalist weeklies, but I would argue that The Man in the Moon was the first satirical weekly in British history. It offered a satire of the Commonwealth and its leaders and supporters as a counterblast to the official propaganda disseminated through pro-government newsbooks. The title page of the first issue of The Man in the Moon is indicative of Crouch's approach to what journalism was supposed to be about in the post-regicide era. Could you move to the next slide, please, Veronica? Besides providing textual echoes of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream as signifying that the political play unfolding on England's stage was mere buffoonery, the opening poem stated Crouch's satirical intentions, and in particular, his resolve to lampoon the actors involved in this political farce. My course, I mean to run with pricking bushes at my back. I'll make satiric whips. There's not a traitor, but I'll thwack until a wench and skips. My dog is old and bites full sore. Then tyrants have a care. Crouch's satire was clearly targeted at those in power, the ruling oligarchy that had brought about the demise of the Stuart monarchy and were set to oppress and enslave the people of England. Crouch's ultimate goal was to denigrate the political clique that ruled post-regicide England and to mock a world gone mad, which he hoped to redress with his journalism, an undertaking that justified any breach of propriety or decorum. Those in the parliamentary camp who partly escaped Crouch's scurrilous pen were the levellers. Thus, John Lilburne and his friends were given relatively fair treatment, even if they occasionally fell prey to his censure, in particular when he felt the need to deny any collusion with them. And as in this tirade, could you move to the next slide, please? Okay, thank you. I will just read, the sentence in the extract in bold type. What are these levellers? Why, none but the godly party, the ladder that the rebellious junta have got up to the height of their wickedness, and now, having no further use of them, would fling them down and destroy them. Crouch had no sympathy for the lebalist political program based on the defense of the free people of England, whose natural rights were to be enshrined in the binding constitutional text, the Agreement of the People. It is a fact, though, that he regarded them and their followers as objective allies in a hostile environment and hoped to capitalize on their own dissatisfaction with the Commonwealth, which they expressed in a series of pamphlets in the spring and summer of 1649. Crouch probably thought it wise and politically expedient to encourage their protest in case it should weaken and destabilize the Commonwealth. Crouch's satire was especially, though not solely present in the snippets of poetry that gave The Man in the Moon, like other Royalist Mercuries, its distinct flavor. Crouch recycled a variety of poetic forms, ranging from ballads and dirges to epitaphs and epigrams in which he lashed out at Commonwealth leaders. Satire was a literary weapon that allowed newsbook writers like Crouch to promote an ethos of indignation. Now let me move on to Mercurius Democritus and its alias, the Laughing Mercury, which ran from April 1652 to February 1654. The avowed goal of this publication was to provoke laughter, to make, quote, impudence to blush, and all honest souls laugh, which is the end and scope of this my undertaking, as the programmatic statement in the first issue of Mercurius Democritus has it. In the opening poem of an issue of the Laughing Mercury, the same publication as Democritus, but with a different name, Crouch explained that his approach to news writing consisted in exposing the follies of the world while remaining non-committal. Could you move to the next slide, please, Veronica? Let me quote from the poem. Free mirth is all I aim to write, to laugh down in lies and follies, to tell some stories of the night, to cure melancholy. Nor law, nor state do I offend, nor plot or evil do I intend. My muse hates strife or faction. Crouch is resolved not to offend anyone and to steer clear of factionalism may be interpreted as the posture of a journalist who had chosen to give up the fight altogether. He may thus have renounced supplying his political adversaries with the pungent criticisms that he'd heaped on them in The Man in the Moon. In a contemporary pamphlet entitled The Weepers of Bed of Snakes is Broken, Samuel Shepherd, the editor of the Royalist newsbook Mercurius Elenticus, called Crouch, I quote, a mercenary scribbler who usurped the name of Democritus, so noble a philosopher, and derided Mercurius Democritus as a ridiculous, nonsensical Mercury. It is a fact that Crouch's political affiliation, as reflected by Mercurius Democritus, was problematic, and that a fair amount of political expediency may have shaped his journalism in the early 1650s. Most of the news presented in it is made up of cock and bull stories, which Crouch called his more delightful or more merry news, as for example, when a trivial incident like a fire shot in the air triggered a chain reaction out of all proportion that left the world on the verge of chaos. These stories made for composite pieces of writing combining real and marvelous elements or starting off as factual accounts that then degenerated into nonsensical, hallucinatory visions. Such stories were nothing new. Pamphlets describing strange phenomena circulated in the Elizabethan era and satisfied readers' appetite for sensational news. What characterizes Crouch's rendering of reality in Mercurius Democritus is reductio ad absurdum, whereby absurdity is pushed to the extreme and nonsense prevails, as exemplified by a mock epitaph on a fart. Could you please move on to the next slide, Veronica? An epitaph, a mock epitaph on a fart, which reads like a parody of parodied epitaphs, but then the parody loses all of its typical causticity. Crouch's use of poetry in The Man in the Moon and its successor, Mercurius Democritus, ran the gamut of satirical writing, from the acerbic denigration of individuals, especially present in the former, and to a lesser extent in the latter, to the tongue-in-cheek anatomy of the author's topsy-turvy world in Democritus. Sometimes these satiric modes combined, but they seem to reflect the various moods that had overcome Royalist journalism and the loyalist camp at large in post-regicide England. The fighting spirit that had animated Royalist sympathizers in the months following the execution of Charles I and justified agonistic, and vengeful writing seemed to have deserted them when the Commonwealth stood on safer ground after the defeat of Charles II at Worcester in 1651, and was eventually, when the Commonwealth was eventually given recognition by continental powers, including Spain and France. Crouch, in his 1649-1650 newsbook, The Man in the Moon, provoked laughter as a means to an end in order to satirize the caste in power. He somehow changed tack in his 1652-1654 periodical Mercurius Democratus, and even if he still made fun of others in it, laughter tended to become an end in itself, as Crouch's writing gave way to nonsense, nonsensically past all sense and reason, as one of his antagonists put it. Why did authors, and this is now I'd like to move on to my next and last part and answer this question, the question I put at the beginning of my presentation: why did authors like Crouch and his contemporaries include poetry in their newspapers? So this is what I'd like to wish to look at now, and this perhaps we can talk about it in the Q&A session as well. Well, the first set of conclusions linked to this question, the first question is, why did royalist authors begin to include poetry in their Mercuries in the autumn of 1647 of all times? So why in 1647? Could you move on to the next slide, please? Move to the next slide, Veronica. So this is my conclusion. And next slide, please. Right. Only wide guesses can be made. The first issue of Mercurius Pragmaticus in late September 1647 featured this programmatic statement. Next slide, please. I'll have a care of both mine ears and stand sentinel at Putney to hear what news and how the squires go. The introduction of poetry in newspapers coincided with the development of royalist journalism in 1647 after the defeat of the royalist army in the First Civil War and at the time of the radicalization of the New Model Army. In the preceding years, royalist Mercuries were few and far between, and the polemics that they carried was invariably expressed in prose. The inclusion of poetry was an innovation, and it marked the heyday of royalist journalism. Royalist Mercuries seem to have been especially revived by the radicalization of the New Model Army at a time when the rank and file had elected agitators to voice their grievances, and these agitators were about to meet with the army grandees at Putney outside London to discuss the future settlement of the kingdom. Needham passed sarcastic comments on the Presbyterian majority in Parliament and on the Scots. There is no doubt that he, together with other royalist authors, tried to play the army and the radicals off against Parliament. The radicals included the Levellers, who championed political liberties based on natural law and made a case for a more democratic form of government based on regular elections and quasi-universal suffrage. Generally, royalist newspaper writers were in two minds about the Levellers. They were critical of the sect's democratic agenda, but they saw them as temporary allies when political circumstances dictated it. The inclusion of poetry in royalist newspapers coincided with these political developments, or perhaps I should say the revival of royalist newspapers may well have been caused by the radicalization of English politics. However, the authors could have chosen to write polemic in prose, as had their predecessors, instead of turning to poetry. It seems to me that the decision to include poetry was as much of a literary as of a political nature. Or rather, the use of literary forms, poetry here, reflected and underpinned partisanship for two reasons. First, the inclusion of poetry was certainly meant to signal the political identity of the publication to potential readers. This feature pointed to an identity that was typically royalist. Poetry mixed in with news was indeed a hallmark of royalist journalism, as I said, except when parliamentarian authors jumped on the bandwagon and also made a point of incorporating poetry into their newspapers. Second, the inclusion of poetry allowed authors to defend a political cause by drawing on a literary tradition and in the process to fashion themselves as participants in this tradition. They were well aware that they were producing writings whose purpose was to try and convince readers to actively support the cause they were fighting for by entertaining them at the same time. Horatian variety was certainly part and parcel of the textual economy of Mercury's, which reflected the hybrid nature of both newspapers and pamphlets. Now, a second set of conclusions may be linked to this question: what did the use of poetry reveal about such times of crisis as the English Revolution of the mid-17th century? First, I would argue that this testified to an increasing politicization of literary forms and a growing literariness of political expression. Second, by blending high culture and low culture, poetry in English periodicals allowed for a fair amount of fluidity between literary forms, making generic crossovers possible and giving rise to hybrid productions that could cater for a wide and diverse readership. In addition to their entertaining quality and their satirical value, poetic bits and parts were suited to reading practices and rituals that accommodated fragments. Such material, for example, is maybe found in miscellanies or commonplace books. However, the ephemerality of news and more generally of cheap print probably made them more elusive. Third, the growing commodification of cheap print, and of this poetry in particular, contributed to the formation of public opinion, with presses churning out newspapers and pamphlets that were intended to influence politically sensitive readers, and that ultimately, I would argue, had a knock-on effect on the course of events. Fourth, the tone may have been light, even playful, but the authors must surely have seen their publications as necessary contributions to the war, a form of participatory politics. Connected with the notion of participatory politics is the idea that the inclusion of poetic snippets in newspapers authenticated and legitimized these publications as being worthy of fighting for the cause that they defended, primarily the king and the Stuart monarchy, since the use of poetry in newsbooks was initiated by the royalists. The parliamentarian camp obviously saw an interest in replicating such a format. Last, this is a tentative conclusion, but it seems to me that the inclusion of poetic snippets pointed to a literary revolution within the print revolution that possibly testifies to a revolutionary moment within the revolution. Revolutionary politics made for revolutionary writing techniques, a feature that made the English Revolution a unique political and editorial event. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for such a fascinating talk. I'm opening now the floor for questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function or chat in the chat box. Oh, we have a comment here. I thought that it was a question. But while people are still thinking about the questions, I have some of my own. Oh, but no, I'm going to give the floor to Michael Braddock. I can make my question later.
Right.
I guess you're muted. Sorry.
I was just saying I don't think I should supersede you, really, but thank you very much. Laurent, I really enjoyed the paper and I found your analysis really satisfying and convincing. As a historian, I'm more interested, I suppose, or learn more from the literary analysis. And I just wanted to ask you about the long-term legacy of this kind of writing and whether it remains something distinctively British and whether you can see a genealogy from here through Restoration comedy and so forth. Just about the long-term legacies of this kind of literary production.
Well, thank you for your question. Well, that is interesting. I don't actually know for sure whether there was, this kind of literary production had a long-standing legacy, but I don't know whether it found its way into the Restoration comedy. I assume that because of satire. I mean, it influeed later literary texts. I couldn't tell you about Restoration comedies. I mean, these. I mean, you know, Restoration comedies, this is clearly drama, whereas we're talking about poetry here. But so it's a different form of literature. But interestingly enough, in some Mercuries, not all of them, in some Mercuries, there are like some sort of theatrical dialogues. You know, and I think this is just to keep this kind of, you know, dramatic tradition alive. You know, the kind of dramatic tradition that sort of prospered in the Elizabethan era and the early Jacobean era, and some of it was actually taken up, you know, by news books and especially Mercury's, and so it was another way, if you like, basically of using literary forms, not just poetry but also drama included in newspapers, which I think is why it's interesting also to study these publications, both, I mean, from a historical perspective but also from a literary perspective. I don't know if this answers your question, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, I misspoke really in Restoration comedy. I just meant about the literary legacies as a whole of
yeah,
you know, the satirical.
Well, yeah, possibly. Yeah, think of Swift. Yeah, possibly. Yeah. There's possibly. There's. I don't know if there's something uniquely British about this. There's certainly something uniquely British about these newspapers. And there was no such thing in France. I mean, produced on the continent then, and I mean, even, you know, the Mazarinades, all these pamphlets against Cardinal Mazarin. Some of them were newspapers, but they didn't include poetry. Or some of them were pamphlets, and they include poetry, but they were not newspapers. So you see, and it seems to me that the combination of both news writing and poetry was something typically British, or typically English, basically. Yeah. Thank you.
Next, we have Katy Jill.
Sorry, really struggling with the camera and the microphone here. Hello, Laurent.
Hello, Katie. It's good to see you. Good to see you.
You too. Excuse the really messy kitchen. I just wanted to, if you don't mind, mention poems on affairs of state, which happened by about the 1680s. I haven't sat and Googled them, but that's a good source for following the sort of next generation. But I absolutely loved that paper, unsurprisingly. I just thought it was extraordinary and really brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I also wondered, though, how much of the theory of comedy that you're talking about here you were intuiting or inferring versus how much of it was people like Crouch, actively citing from the earlier people. I mean, you know, Marshall and Aristotle and so on. So I'm afraid I've taken you in exactly the opposite direction to Michael, who wanted to go forward. I'm just saying, you know, does he say, I know these theories of comedy, or, you know, is he placing himself really actively within a tradition, I wonder? Mm. It's really hard on the spot, but it's just your general impression. I wouldn't know.
I understand. Yeah, well, my general impression is that he is, and he was certainly educated. I mean, most of the writers were actually educated people. There's no question on that. And so they had received that degree of education, and probably, you know, they attended school. So they must have known. They must have known about Shakespeare. They must have known about you know, early modern drama, and they must have known about Aristotle. So I'm not sure actually how much, you know, because of course they don't mention their sources. they're just intertextual elements basically, and they borrow from other sources, and sometimes it's actually difficult to trace the source. For the Man in the Moon, it was quite clear, because to me the intertextual references to Midsummer Night's Dream is obvious, but sometimes it's not that obvious, and it's clear that I may have missed out on some of the references. So these authors do not mention their sources, but then again, it's part of this sort of intertextual economy. I mean, when they basically borrowed from other authors, and but I'm pretty sure that they knew about literary forms, and what the impact of literary and what the impact of literary forms was about. Basically, I'm pretty sure that they were aware of that, what they were doing, and they didn't do it by chance, but they did it consciously, I would say.
Curse them never giving their sources.
Ariel, please.
Hi, Laurent.
Hello, Ariel. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you very much for a fascinating paper. Quick comment and then a question which derives from that. So you're emphasizing the unique quality of the literary form in a publication for news. I haven't looked at it in a long time, but are there any Dutch publications that also use this hybrid format? Because I do know that some Dutch publications definitely have a mixture of poetics and information, but not necessarily in news format. So you may want to double check that. But my actual question was the heritage of this. How much of this is the legacy of a ballad tradition, where ballads are used in particular in the earlier part of the 17th century as a political weapon? And you can also, obviously, you've mentioned the stage and drama, and the way that some drama, obviously, particularly the history plays, again, has a very obvious contemporary political resonance. How much of that inheritance is being reflected and inflected in what you've been analysing and discussing?
Okay, thank you for these questions. As far as Dutch publications are concerned, I haven't come across any Dutch newspapers that include poetry. It seems to me that all Dutch newspapers, to the best of my knowledge, that is, were Corantos, basically. So, the first kind of newspapers that were popular in the 1630s, basically, that is to say, publications that include, like diurnals, that included, dispatches of news, items of news, on a chronological basis. And so they were more factual. There was very, very little comment, mixed in with the news. Very little comment. So this is basically what I know. And it has actually struck me that I couldn't find anything like that on the European continent at that time, either in France, as I said, or in the Low Countries. Given, and that's interesting, considering the fact that that Corantos were invented, if you like, in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries, and they were exported to England. And this is what gave rise to this kind of craze for newspapers. But as it happens, I haven't come across any of any Dutch newspapers with poetry in them. Now, as far as the legacy tradition, for example, the ballad tradition is concerned, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it in newspapers, clearly. The opening poem published, in one of the issues of Insanus, Mercurius Insanissimus, is clearly a ballad. It is clearly a ballad. Then again, it's difficult to trace, the ballad, where it actually comes from. And I'm pretty sure that that these newspapers were meant to be read, but they were also meant to be read out. So so they were part of this kind of conviviality, whereby a group of people would come together and perhaps listen to someone reading out the news. And so yeah, there's a lot of these poems have a musical quality to them, and these, especially those that have a playful tone, if you like, and I think it makes them easy to memorize, and so they have perhaps more, like, political potency than, the kind of poetry that would be a bit more serious, possibly.
Thank you, that's great. I'll leave it to other people for questions, though. Obviously, you've now opened up a new question, which is a question beloved of many people here, which is the public sphere, is where would these performances of reading these news books take place? But I'll leave other people to come in.
That is the tricky question.
Yeah. Well, I don't know for sure. I mean, it's not clear. We don't know how they were read. Actually, I haven't come across any sort of form, any reference to the reading of these newspapers. So it's hard actually to know exactly how they were read, But even, I mean, measuring the impact of these newspapers is a bit of a challenge, of course. And so this is why so my conclusions are tentative conclusions, because I'm not actually sure. There's just, these are just hypotheses, basically.
Lívia.
Thank you for such a fantastic paper, Professor. I was wondering a little bit in terms of, not sure if it makes a lot of sense, but I was thinking a little bit in terms of rhetoric, because you mentioned how you consider that these this format, these use of these poetry and this specific format of these mercures were particularly British, and this wasn't seen in France and all that. And I was thinking if you think it would be possible for us to think about this in terms of a specific type of rhetoric that arises from these surrounding news and surrounding this. I was also trying to think in terms of the public sphere, but do you think it's possible to think about it in terms of a specific type of rhetoric that arises during this period, precisely because of the context, but also because of the material vehicle that these news books provide for it? Do you think that would be feasible, possible to think these terms?
I wouldn't talk about in terms of rhetoric, because the rhetoric, for example, was similar in France, except that, for example, satire was an ingredient, just a form that was used, or a literary device, if you like, that was used, and for example, in pamphlets against Mazarin. So that so I wouldn't talk in terms of rhetoric, because the rhetoric was similar. In Mazarinade, for example. I would talk about form. I would talk about form and the format of these newspapers. This, to me, is specific to England. I would talk about form rather than rhetoric. Form, that is to say, basically the interaction between prose and poetry in a periodical. In a publication that features periodicity and seriality. And so this is what I think is unique about this kind of, this piece of writing. I don't know if this answers your question, Lívia.
No, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I've put myself on the list, otherwise I wouldn't be able to make my questions. I have 3 questions, but I will try to make it quick. And well, if we don't have time for that, I can ask you later. But I was thinking, when you were replying to Ariel's question about the ballads and the kind of music and all of these details on the tradition of the ballads, I was thinking about when we think about broadside ballads, sometimes we know that there is a reuse of the songs, or maybe of the typographical issues. We know that this is something that is always coming around the public sphere, in a sense. I would like to ask you if there is anything similar to that. These structures are reused in other poems, or how this kind of rhythm is utilized in other newspapers. I don't know. Is there any kind of tradition of this kind of exchange, maybe? This is the first one, and later I can make the others.
Okay, yeah, to answer this question, I think there's some sort, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of recycling, if you like. They borrowed from a long-standing, satirical tradition that goes back to basically Horace or Juvenal, especially Juvenal and Lucian, I would say. So they do recycle a lot of material by borrowing, from previous sources, going back to ancient times. And so they built a kind, as of 1647, they built a kind of literary tradition. And interestingly enough, these papers, as I said, were imitated by other authors. And yes, I would agree with you. The material that they use is actually recycled. It's more or less the same form, that occurs and reoccurs, basically. Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. By the way, the parliamentarians did exactly the same. They tried to emulate the royalists. Basically, they imitated and emulated the royalists, probably because they realized, I don't know actually, because they realized that these newspapers had an impact and they served an interesting political purpose.
Thank you, Professor. John, please.
Hi, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Now, I don't know about these as sources, so forgive me if my question is going to seem very basic. But I was just curious as to what the business model of the Mercuries was. I mean, where were they printed? How do they reach the people who read them or listened to them? And then that also has an effect then on perhaps on who the audience was. I mean, were they like, say, contemporary newspapers where, in Britain, one will read newspapers that reinforce your own prejudices. So I'm just wondering, anyway, about the business model, really, of the Mercuries.
They were part of the thriving printing economy, that's for sure. Now, as for they were produced. I think they were basically homemade products, if you like. So the authors may have had portable presses because we're talking about Mercury's here, because they were constantly chased by the authorities. So they had to be able to sort of run away and hide away, and so they had portable presses, and that's how I think they were produced. I don't know for sure whether royalist authors collaborated with printers, established printers. I'm not sure that they did. I couldn't tell you. It's the case. It's the case. Parliamentarian newspapers, their authors collaborated with printers, and they were sold by Mercury women. Basically, women called Mercury women. They were sold on the streets of London, especially. And I think when they harbored poetry, when they included poetry, they were immediately recognizable. So I think it was a brand, if you like, that distinguished them from other newspapers. Well, I guess that's I think. But now, were they profitable? Were they profitable? I don't know. I assume, of course, we don't know. But what the printer, what the print runs were. We have no idea for sure. I don't know if they were profitable. They must have been profitable enough for authors to make some sort of a living, at least to earn some money. But so, and in that sense, they served, they served a personal purpose as well as a political purpose. But we don't know how much and how many copies were actually produced. So they were certainly not as profitable as some of the parliamentary newspapers, clearly.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure.
Katie, please. Katie?
Sorry, did you say Katie?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I couldn't hear. Thanks. Sorry to keep coming back. I got my first question out of the way just so that I could check that there was a history there, if that's right, which you answered. Thanks so much. Right. What I really loved about the paper was the way that you trace different kinds of humour across the years, sort of charting and mapping it to, you know, kind of royalist initial disbelief that the Commonwealth was a thing, so let's let it. And leading up to a kind of resignation.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what I find so interesting about that, and it is almost a question, is just how cultural and of the moment laughter is. I think it's harder to read than tragedy, actually, in terms of tone, because of how immersed you have to be in your own culture to pick that up. And so there is almost a question coming out of it, which is, I understand entirely that they're using comedy to show their aristocratic credentials sometimes, and I understand entirely that they're also trying to win a populist vote. But at the same time, why use something as elusive and as slippery and as easy to misinterpret as comedy? There isn't an answer, but I just love your, you know, kind of, you're immersed in this stuff at the moment, and it does seem to be counterintuitive, doesn't it, in a way, when you're trying to win a battle, a propaganda war.
Well, I think it's difficult to interpret for us. I don't know whether it was just difficult to interpret for contemporaries, because I'm pretty sure that they picked up the references. You know, for example, when the authors wrote about you know, Cromwell's nose, they knew that, you know, Cromwell had a long nose, and so this is something that they understood. I'm not sure that they were able to sort of pick up all the references, but at least there are some of them that they were able to understand. And I assume that the degree of understanding depending on the people. But it's what is difficult for us, I think, for contemporary students, including my students, because I also teach my students about these publications, is to get all the contemporary references. That's extremely difficult. It's the same when we read satire, you know, satirical newspapers. You know, and it's just because you need to be aware of, basically, you need to be aware of events, and you need to be aware of political and of debates at large, if you like, to understand the references. And that is also a challenge. Also, what you said about the development of newsbooks, I think, I tried to. Well, I'm still trying to figure out, you know, why they developed, why they emerged in 1647, and why they stopped publication at some point, and why they resumed publication at another point, and including in 1660, you know, when the protectorate sort of fell apart, and when the restoration of the monarchy was in the offing, and to me, this points here to moments within the revolution that I would say basically periods of crisis. Well, the whole revolution, I mean, was a period of crisis, but within the revolution, there were also moments or periods of crisis. And I suspect it's the same with the French Revolution, although I'm not familiar with it. I know a bit about the French Revolution, but there must be, you know, moments within the French Revolution which gave rise to various, to this kind of to specific types of publications. And interestingly enough, you know, when Crouch resumed publication in 1652, it's because he'd been released from prison. He was arrested in 1650 and released from prison in 1652, and he went back to writing again. But this time round, it was the more, how shall I say, it was the harmless kind of publication, you know, like nonsensical publication, which was not as politically charged as his Man in the Moon.
I have 2 other questions if no one wants to add anything. Hopefully we have time for that. The first one is, I was thinking about the typographical issues while I was seeing some of the pictures of the Mercuries. I've read lots of works by Roger Lestrange, and I know that it's a little bit late, but the typography in his works is something really important. Despite it's not poetry, we're talking about prose, but it is very important to the meaning. The words that he would ask his printer to put in italics or other typographical resources that would create emphasis, or maybe would create this playful tone as well. And I would like to ask if you had any clues on that, on how some of the words were in italics, for example, and how it could be understood within the context of the poetry.
Well, it's exactly the same. I think it's the same in all newspapers, all Civil War newspapers. They included italics and sometimes words in bold type, but especially italics. And these words in italics were meaningful, of course. And I think they made some sort of, for a kind of reading that was not extensive, but, you know, the kind of skimming through newspapers, and so that it caught people's eyes. And by, you know, and because italics actually were a form of emphasis, you know, that they are, and especially names were in italics, not just names, but especially names. And I think it made it, you know, the idea was to catch people's attention, catch people's eyes, so that they would perhaps focus on one specific item. And it's the same in the poems, mind you. Some of the words are actually in italics. Yes, so typography does play an important role, I think. Yeah. And as well as typeset, as I said, especially in titles. For example, I don't know. Well, no, perhaps if you, I was going to ask you to go back to slide number 5, but perhaps no. I don't want to bother you with that.
I can do it. It's really
you can do
quick.
it. Okay, that's fine. I think slide number 5, which has Mercurius Pragmaticus and Mercurius Elenchicus on it. Yeah, that's it. Now, if you have a look at Mercurius Pragmaticus, you know, the typeset is a bit strange. You know, but the kind of the letters that were used actually were, and they sort of authenticated the newspaper. And it was clear, and further issues that Mercurius Pragmaticus had the same letters, you know, in the titles, except, I mean, when counterfeits came in, some of them sort of stole, if you like, this typeset, and they tried to imitate this very, you know, the letters themselves. But sometimes it's possible to distinguish genuine newspapers, or original newspapers rather than genuine, original newspapers from their from counterfeit newspapers because of the typeset. And you can see that this is not number 1, and so Needham made a point of using these letters, the kind of serifed U and V instead of U in Pragmaticus, and it came up again. It came up again until, you know, this typeset was actually stolen by counterfeiters, and then he had to move to a different typeset. right? Yeah. So, but basically, and I think because you mentioned italics in these poems, there are italics actually. So yes, I mean, typography played an important part in these newspapers. Yeah, absolutely. It sort of guided the reading of them, if you wish.
Yeah, of course, and especially if it was made to be read aloud, it could be very significant in that aspect as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. And if we have time for just one other question, I would like to ask you if you could expand a little bit on one of the conclusions that you had on how we can see a kind of literary revolution within the printing revolution. I was thinking about that because this expression, the printing revolution, is very, it's a topic of debate, and several authors will argue that no, we cannot use that, and others will try to prove that we can talk in these terms because there was a peak of publications. But in the sense that if I understood the things that you were bringing to discussion, we can talk about a revolution when we consider the literary genre or the forms and how the poetics of the political and the textual discussion were in the public sphere. So I would like to ask you to expand a little bit on that conclusion, if that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to say something that may be a bit, I don't know, polemical, but I would say I'm not happy with the term the British Civil Wars. I'm happier with the term the British Revolution, the English Revolution, or British Revolution if you prefer, because there was a revolution in mid-century England, actually, in mid-17th century Britain, on a par with the French Revolution, somehow. You see, I mean, the English killed their king. They committed regicide. So this is revolution, and they established a republic. So this is revolution, and so I think there was a print revolution because there was a peak, as you said, in the production, especially the production of cheap print. So now, what I mean by literary revolution, perhaps it's a bit over emphatic. I don't know, but I mean that existing forms, were made to use new purposes, perhaps, and they were used in a particular manner that differed from previous uses, actually. So this is why I talked about a literary revolution within the revolution, precisely because of the use of these forms and the recycling, if you like, of these forms, but they were meant to serve a particular purpose and they were used in a particular manner.
Thank you, Professor. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, I'm afraid I have to finish the session due to time, but it was brilliant. I guess that everybody was really impressed by such a fabulous talk. So thank you once again, Professor, for accepting our invitation. We were honored to have you here today. I would also like to invite everyone to attend our last session of the year, which will happen on the 23rd of November. We will receive Professor Luis Felipe Silvério Lima here from Brazil. He will talk about, if I'm not mistaken, some fake news and fake kings. So everyone is invited. Thank you very much for all the questions and this brilliant debate.